Well, welcome to everyone here in the auditorium, as well as those of you who are in attendance by way of Zoom. My name is Michael Gomez, and I am the director of the Center for the Study of Africa and the African Diaspora, CSI, who, in conjunction with Blacks, specifically Black Americans, Caribbean Studies, we're very pleased to sponsor our guest for this evening, our speaker for this evening, Professor Yesenia Barragan. She is a historian of race, slavery, and emancipation in Afro-Latin America and the African diaspora in the Americas. She is an assistant professor of Latin American history at Rutgers University in Brunswick, New Jersey. Professor Barragan is the author of Freedom's Captives, Slavery and Gradual Emancipation on the Colombian Black Pacific, published in 2021 by Cambridge University Press, which explores the process of the gradual abolition of slavery in Colombia. And she has also published Selling Our Death Masks, Cash for Gold in the Age of Austerity, published by Zero Press in 2014, a surrealist ethnography of cash for gold shops in the wake of the 2008 economic crisis. Freedom's Captives won the 2022 Wesley Logan Prize for Best Book on African Diaspora History from the American Historical Association and the Association for the Study of African Life and History. The 2022 Best Book Award for the 19th Century section of the Latin American Studies Association, LASA. It received an honorable mention for the 2022 Michael Jimenez Prize for the Colombia section of the Latin American Studies Association, and was a finalist for the outstanding first book prize from the Association for the Study of the Worldwide Diaspora, ASWA. She is the principal investigator of the Free Wound Project, a Spanish, Portuguese, and English language digital collection of gradual emancipation laws across the 18th and 19th century Atlantic world. With the support of the National Endowment for the Humanities, Professor Barragan is currently embarked on a new book project titled A Country of Their Own, African Americans and the Promise of Antebellum Latin America, which examines Latin America as a beacon of freedom and immigration destination for free and fugitive African Americans during the antebellum period. Professor Barragan, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. My name is Yesenia. I hope you're all doing well. Before I begin, of course, I have to thank Professor Mike Gomez for inviting me to share my work with you all today, and Simone for all of their help in arranging the logistics of my visit. It is truly, of course, an honor to be invited by Dr. Gomez, whose work I profoundly admire, and to be here with all of you at NYU. To many historians and scholars that I profoundly admire. You know, a lot of you in the audience. So thank you so much for coming out. Today, I'm going to be talking about my recently published book, Freedom's Captives, Slavery and Gradual Emancipation on the Colombian Black Pacific. And this book is a narrative-driven social, political, and geographical study of the gradual abolition of slavery in Colombia, focusing especially on the Pacific coast of Colombia, which was the gold mining center of the former Spanish Empire, and one of the largest areas in the Americas inhabited primarily by people of African descent. The study begins in 1821, when a gradual emancipation law was enacted in Colombia, and then examines the immediate post-emancipation period, beginning in 1852, when slavery and gradual emancipation was finally abolished. So today I'm going to be talking mostly about content from chapters 3 and 4 of my book, which focus on the political project of gradual emancipation and the generation of captive children most impacted by this project. Now, in order to get a sense of the significance of the book, I think it's helpful to reflect on its larger contributions. By focusing on the protracted process of gradual emancipation in Colombia, the study deepens our historical understanding of the experiential borderlands between slavery and freedom in the hemisphere. But more than that, the study fundamentally reframes the historiography of gradual emancipation in the Americas by inserting Colombia into the narrative. The foundational studies of gradual emancipation focus on what I call the first and third waves of gradual emancipation that unfolded in the late 18th and 19th centuries, particularly in the northern United States for the first wave and Cuba and Brazil for the third wave. This project turns the second wave of gradual emancipation in Latin America that occurred in between these two waves, that is during the early 19th century, particularly in Spanish South America. As opposed to the first wave, the second wave of gradual emancipation in this region included all or nothing national propositions that sparked cataclysmic conflicts resulting in extensions of bondage and even war. The hemispheric impact of the second wave later influenced the adoption of gradual emancipation in Cuba and Brazil, the most significant bastions of slavery in 19th century Latin America. Even more, a view from Colombia shifts our understanding of hemispheric abolitionism. From my research, I discovered that a diverse array of abolitionists across the Atlantic world viewed Colombia as a model of emancipation in the early to mid 19th century. And so Colombia was far from marginal in this larger public sphere of white abolitionism. But apart from this historiographical contribution, this project focuses on the historiographically little-known world of the majority Black Pacific lowlands of Colombia, a center of the Black Pacific world, a place that constantly escaped white governability. This is a story about a non-plantation, rural gold mining economy that habitually sowed terror while also opening up unusual opportunities for freedom, thereby upending a neat dichotomy between rural and urban slavery. This is also a story about an extraordinary place, which is officially one of the rainiest places in the world, where there are literally hundreds of gold-rich rivers commanded by independent boatmen and Black women gold miners. You can get a glimpse of them here. Plentiful rainforest cover to escape and commit disappearing acts. Free Black and Indigenous villages managed by mayors of African and Indigenous descent. Today, it is home to Colombia's famous autonomous collective Black territories, territories that witnessed some of the most horrific violence of the conflict, the Civil War in the late 20th century, and despite the 2016 peace accords, continue to be plagued by paramilitary violence against Afro-Colombian activists and social movements. Acts that I argue are reflective of not just the deep afterlife of slavery, but also the afterlife of gradual emancipation in Colombia. Finally, this is but one story among many that comprise the Black Pacific world, an emerging paradigm in Black and Latin American studies referring to the formation of African descendant communities and subjectivities across the expansive Pacific Ocean. Situating the Pacific lowlands within this broader Black Pacific paradigm allows us to envision alternative histories and world making in a tradition similar to that of the Black Atlantic. So this project is not only about Colombia's role as a metaphorical frontier at the second wave of gradual emancipation in the Americas, but how these hemispheric dynamics were enforced and contested in an extraordinary frontier region. This then is a history of a remarkable place in terrifying times. Before we begin, however, I just want to give a content warning. Some of the topics and scenes of the witnessing are difficult. So if you need to leave or step aside, I completely understand. For now, let's turn to a remote village on the Colombian Black Pacific. Her name was Magdalena. We don't know how old she was when it happened, but we know that she was young, una joven, and that her master deemed it a quote, moderate punishment, a corrective measure for an alleged infraction. And so her master dragged her to the patio, tied up her feet and hands, and placed an iron bar between her thighs. A torture technique universally employed and perfected by the horrifying perpetrators of Atlantic slavery. After repeated floggings, Magdalena was left alone overnight in the mildewed stalks, accompanied only by the steady rain, constellations of stars, and animals that roamed the village of Noanama, a remote indigenous settlement tucked away in the secluded rainforest of Colombia's tropical Pacific lowlands in the late 1840s. Perhaps one or more of the 5 witnesses who later testified to Magdalena's torture that evening tried to comfort her. Perhaps she was tended to by the indigenous woman whom the judge eventually dismissed because she did not know her own age. It is this endless perhaps that collapse into my failure to tell what Saidiya Hartman calls, quote, an impossible story, to jeopardize the status of the event, to displace the received or authorized account, and to imagine what might have happened, or might have been said, or might have been done. By the morning, the damage was plainly visible. The young girl emerged from the stocks, quote, with her left hand permanently disabled, dislocated and atrophied, bearing large scars. For many historians, Magdalena's story is a profoundly familiar one of brutal unfreedom, replete with musty stocks, iron bars, broken bones, and other unspoken punishments that elude the archival hold. Such scenes of torturous subjection form the bedrock of the archives of Atlantic world slavery. Yet, perhaps surprisingly for some, Magdalena's story is also one of violent freedom. Strictly speaking, Magdalena was not a slave. She was a child of the free womb, a new social subject established with the gradual emancipation law adopted in 1821 by slaveholding officials in the newly founded Republic of Gran Colombia, encompassing present-day Colombia in green, Ecuador in pink, and Venezuela in yellow, also the Isthmus of Panama on the Isthmus. Inspired by earlier gradual abolition laws in the late 18th and early 19th century Atlantic world, this law stipulated that all children born from enslaved women after the law's promulgation in 1821 were legally free, but bonded to their mother's masters until the age of 18. Although Magdalena was ostensibly free, her peculiar condition as a captive within an evolving bondage economy in 19th century Colombia allowed her tormentor to believe that he could tear her apart without consequence. For thousands of young individuals like Magdalena, freedom under gradual emancipation produced disastrous consequences. Magdalena's life-negating experience captures the paradox that has defined the making of the modern world in the greater Americas, how the rhetoric and politics of liberal freedom undergirded and extended policies of unfreedom. Freedom's captives explores competing struggles over disparate modes of freedom and bondage in Colombia and the Colombian Pacific during the age of gradual emancipation. I call the 31 years from the law's enactment in 1821 to the final abolition of slavery in 1852, the time of gradual emancipation rule in the Northern Andes. And I do so in order to see this period as a distinct moment in the history of liberal regional governance rather than an inconsequential and benign prelude to the final abolition of slavery. The promissory freedom granted to the children of the free womb during gradual emancipation rule seemed to embody the quintessential paradox of liberal freedom in Colombia. These children were free yet captive, raceless yet Black. As my book intends, the liberal freedom generated through gradual emancipation rule came to constitute a modern mode of racial governance that birthed new forms of social domination while temporarily instituting de facto slavery. Although an end date was set for the eventual abolition of slavery, I argue that speculating slaveholders in Colombia paradoxically came to have an even greater stake in slavery through gradual emancipation rule. Drawing upon a diverse range of sources, including gold mining inventories, congressional debates, and last will and testaments, Freedom's Captives explores how gradual emancipation rule produced even cheaper bondspeople, expanded opportunities for diverse stakeholders to partake in the owning and exploitation of young Black people, and established new political rituals that reinforce the disciplining logic of the slaveholding order. My talk today will explore the making of and the calculating world made out of the Free Womb Law, the central motor of a policy of gradual abolition in the newly constructed Republic of Gran Colombia. Over the course of what would become the final tumultuous months of the Wars of Independence against Spain in the Northern Andes, representatives of Gran Colombia, many of whom were slaveholders, gathered together in the tropical savanna town of Colombia in 1821 to craft the future of the young nation and consequently the future of young people like Magdalena. And here we can see the remains of the church where they met. Many of Colombia's earliest and most sweeping liberal reforms were passed in this historic Congress. Chattel slavery, one of the most contentious legacies of Spanish colonial rule, was also on the negotiating table. And to give you a sense of the scale of slavery in Gran Colombia at the time, in 1825, there were nearly 100,000 enslaved people out of a population of about 2.3 million, or about 4% of the population was enslaved. Now, for some scholars, this statistic may make slavery appear inconsequential in Colombia. In other words, using the long-established terminology of historians of slavery, Colombia on a national level was technically a society with slaves rather than a slave society. And thereby, if we prioritize national demographics, Colombia may appear peripheral in this larger history of Atlantic world slavery. With this thinking, I believe misses two important insights. First, on a more reductive level, Colombia certainly did have very important regional slave societies, such as the Pacific coastal lowlands, where most enslaved captives worked the gold mines during the colonial period. And second, privileging certain demographies can sometimes preclude scholars from imagining the vastly complex social, political, and racial functions of slavery. Here I'm thinking of Sherwin Bryant's work on slavery in colonial Quito, or Wendy Warren's New England Bound. As a side note, moving forward in time, today Colombia is actually the country with the third largest population of African descent in the Americas, after Brazil and the United States. We're returning to the early 19th century Andean world. In response to the problem of slavery in Gran Colombia, the Republican Congress passed a gradual emancipation law in 1821. And at the center of this law was the law of the free womb, or la ley de libertad de vientres. Designed to gradually abolish slavery through the wombs of enslaved women, the biopolitical project of the free womb law legislated that all children born to an enslaved woman would be declared legally free, but remain bonded to their mother's masters until the age of 18. Indeed, across the Atlantic world, the free womb law sought to gradually abolish the institution of slavery by destroying a legal doctrine that defined the very essence of chattel slavery, and that is partus sequitur ventrum, or the status of the child derives from the mother. The free womb law was thus, borrowing from Christina Sharp, one of the earliest, quote, afterlives of partus sequitur ventrum. Despite destroying the genealogical inheritability of chattel slavery, the free womb law created a new dimension in the Colombian debt bondage economy, resting on the technically free yet practically unfree circulation of child and youth quasi-slaves. In short, the free womb law extended and reinscribed on freedom through the rhetoric of freedom. Now, why was a free womb law passed in Colombia? So that you have a sense of the historical context, I want to briefly key in on three main dynamics that functioned on different geographic and political scales. First, the national. The free womb law emerged in a broader political context of the breakdown of chattel slavery in the northern Andes, particularly in the latter years of the War's independence against Spain. In the late 1810s, the leader of Gran Colombia, Simón Bolívar, who you can see depicted here, began to aggressively enlist and recruit enslaved men into the so-called patriot armies. As per Bolivar's orders, enslaved soldiers could acquire their freedom in exchange for a period of service. And so military service in the late 1810s set a critical precedent by tying the patriot cause with enslaved peoples, the so-called patriot cause, with enslaved people's freedom in Colombia. And in turn, the free womb law sought to compensate enslaved recruits for their loyalty to the patriot cause by ostensibly freeing their children. So we can certainly see the free womb law as a kind of family policy, and that's certainly present here in this depiction with mother, child, and father all enslaved or captive in the case of the child. There were, of course, political economic dynamics at play as well. That is, the turn towards gradual rather than immediate emancipation was undoubtedly influenced by the fact that a majority of the post-war economy depended on gold mining, and gold mining depended on enslaved labor. So from the perspective of the Republican rulers, immediate abolition would collapse the economy. The second dynamic to understand why an emancipation law was adopted in Colombia is the Haitian Revolution and the specter of Haiti. In 1804, after 13 years of slave rebellion and war, the Black Republic of Haiti was established. And soon thereafter, Haiti abolishes chattel slavery, thereby becoming the first abolitionist republic in the Americas. In the aftermath of the Haitian Revolution, the Black specter of revolutionary Haiti became a crucial source of racial and political anxiety for the Colombian white elite. In fact, in making his case for emancipation, Simón Bolívar drew upon the specter of Haiti. At the Congress of Angostura in 1819, which formally established the Republic of Gran Colombia, Bolívar summoned the historic and dreaded examples of, quote, the Helots, Spartacus, and of Haiti, that prove that one cannot be simultaneously free and enslaved except by violating at one and the same time the natural law, the political laws, and the civil laws. Behind this backdrop of the Black specter of Haiti, Bolívar famously urged the Congress to confirm the, quote, freedom of the slaves, just as I would beg for my life and the life of the Republic. Lastly, another crucial dynamic was the Atlantic world context. Colombia was not the first government in the Americas to pursue a policy of gradual abolition through a free womb law. Nearly 50 years of gradual emancipation legislation in the revolutionary Atlantic world preceded Colombia's law in 1820. Although the Kingdom of Portugal was actually the first governing body in the Atlantic world to pass a gradual abolition law in 1773, Anglophone North America was the site of the first significant wave of gradual emancipation legislation. Revolutionary ideas of political independence, the powerful anti-slavery protests of the Quakers, and relatively smaller enslaved populations as compared to the US South resulted in the adoption of a gradualist approach to the problem of northern slavery. In 1780, the state of Pennsylvania was the first political body in North America to institute a policy of gradual abolition, which became the blueprint for free birth legislation across the Atlantic world. In the years that followed, other northern states implemented similar gradual abolition measures, including Connecticut and Rhode Island in 1784, New York in 1799, and New Jersey in 1804. And each state adopted free womb emancipation with different ages of bondage. Upper Canada also adopted the Act Against Slavery in 1793, which instituted a free birth policy in British North America. While the first wave of gradual abolition ended in North America in 1804, the second wave picked up in revolutionary South America a few years later under a different constellation of political forces. In 1808, for those of you not familiar with the history, Napoleon's forces invaded and occupied the Iberian Peninsula amidst the collapse of the Spanish monarchy. Consequently, a tidal wave of political crises hit Spain and eventually its American colonies. After news of the crisis crossed the Atlantic, juntas, or councils, led largely by Creoles or individuals of Spanish descent born in the Americas, formed across Spanish America that professed their loyalty to the crown and later complete autonomy in some cases that would evolve into the Wars of Independence against Spain. In Chile, the first free loan law was passed in 1811. Building off of gradual abolition precedents in North America, the Chilean law unconditionally freed all the future children of enslaved women born after its promulgation. Chile was followed by Argentina, which passed a free birth law, free law in 1813 under similar circumstances of the early Wars of Independence. And 8 years later, the Republic of Gran Colombia passes a free law in 1821. So does Peru, just a few months after the Colombian law. And then we have Uruguay in 1825, Bolivia in 1831, Paraguay in 1842. And then we have a final wave, the third wave of gradual emancipation laws in Puerto Rico and Cuba in 1817, and finally Brazil in 1871. And here in this table I designed, you can see the kind of first, second, and third waves of gradual emancipation across the Atlantic world. I should mention that I did not include the British Caribbean colonies here because emancipation was legislated through apprenticeship and not a free loan law. So it's kind of distinct legal process. And here we can see in another table that I designed how these different countries and states adopted different ages of bondage or emancipation. You can see Colombia highlighted with the age of 18, but for example, the state of New York adopted a gradual emancipation law in 1799 and designated free womb bondage to end according to sex. Other polities like New Jersey, Peru, and Paraguay did as well. And here I want to briefly gesture towards a website that I run called the Free Womb Project. You can check out there at the URL below. And this project is a multilingual and specifically Spanish, English, and Portuguese language digital collection of free birth or free womb laws from different governments across the Atlantic world during the late 18th and 19th centuries. And here you can get a sense of the different, well, it's very tiny, but a sense of the different countries and states included. These legal precedents in the revolutionary Atlantic profoundly influenced Colombian statesmen such as Jose Felix de Restrepo, who you can see here. He was the creator of the gradual emancipation law in Colombia. In his opening speech to the Congress in 1821, and the title page of that speech was published the following year, you can see that there. Restrepo referred to the examples of Pennsylvania that, quote, abolished slavery and is one of the most thriving states in North America, in addition to, quote, Chile and Buenos Aires that have declared the freedom of the womb. But the political gaze was not simply unidirectional. In this case, south-north, that is Colombians looking towards North America, or even south-south, Colombians looking toward Chile or Argentina. Interestingly, unbeknownst to scholars of Atlantic anti-slavery, abolitionist politicians from England, the United States, Portugal, and Brazil viewed Colombia as a model of abolition during the early to mid 19th century. In 1824, for example, a few months after the Demerara Rebellion, a massive slave rebellion in British Guiana, the Marquis of Lansdowne petitioned the British House of Lords to pass an abolitionist measure, pointing out how, quote, the state of Colombia had made provisions for the gradual extinction of slavery. Care had been taken in Colombia to secure to all parties compensation for loss, and the manumission of slaves has been attended with considerable immediate advantages to the masters themselves. Later that month, Earl Grosvenor of Westminster declared that he, quote, wished some measure to be adopted to obviate this, referring to the slave rebellion in the British colonies, a measure, something like that, which had been agreed to in Colombia. And there are several other examples from the British. Meanwhile, in 1836, the famed New England abolitionist Lydia Maria Child publishes The Evils of Slavery, where she cites the abolitionist measure of the, quote, Congress of Colombia among a list of other exemplary emancipatory legislation. At the Congress of Bogotá in 1821, Colombian representatives not only transformed the institution of chattel slavery in the Northern Andes, they also helped formulate a blueprint for fellow white abolitionists in the Atlantic world. So broadly, we can see that the Colombian Emancipation Law emerged as a context of the Wars of Independence, the Haitian Revolution, and Atlantic world radical abolitionism. For the remainder of my talk, I'm going to focus on the new social subject that was created by the Colombian Free Womb Law, and that is the free womb captive. The free womb law was riddled with paradoxes that lay at the heart of early 19th century racial liberalism. The law declared that free womb children were born free, but in reality fixed a term limit on their legalized captivity. Moreover, the free womb child was not explicitly considered a slave, but like a slave could be bought and sold on the marketplace. The free womb law codified these children's circulation in the economy of slavery and made it easier for slaveholders to procure ostensibly freeborn captives. Thus, while slaveholders, particularly in Western Colombia, which was the historic stronghold of slavery, vehemently derided the law as theft, some of them nevertheless saw the free womb law as a real economic opportunity to cash in on especially cheap pools of unfree labor. As one slaveholder in the 1840s recounted, quote, a 7-year-old slave would cost 150 to 200 pesos. Who doesn't know that a free womb child of such an age could only be sold for 60 pesos? One official even developed an informal system of categorizing the sale price of free womb children, asserting that the, quote, median price of the children younger than 7 years old is 30 pesos. Those between 7 and 14, 40 pesos. And those who exceed this age up to 18 years old, 50 pesos. I should also note that elsewhere in South America, formal systems categorizing the sale price of free womb children were proposed, as in Uruguay in 1838. You can see that proposal here in this table, proposed table regulating the sale price of free womb children in the Uruguayan markets. See, los de un año, those who are they're old, 30 pesos, los de dos, 40 pesos, los de tres, 45 pesos. So we can think of this as kind of free womb market regulation in Uruguay at the time. Yet more than just economic opportunity, the free womb law influenced the economic management culture of slaveholders in Colombia. We can get a sense of this by comparing mining inventories from the Pacific Coast executed before and after the 1821 law. Prior to the law, slaveholders in the region exhibited only a general sense of how an enslaved person's age affected their value. This is evident in the informal language used to describe the different ages of enslaved gold miners. So this is an image from one of the records I used in my book. It's part of an inventory of the property, human and otherwise property, owned by a female slaveholder. Her name is Nicola Cabecera. And when I was in the archive, I actually found a map where her gold mine and her house is located. It's in the bottom. I guess that's left. Yeah, left. And then just a little north is actually where her mother and father are. So you can see this is kind of very part of the kind of family enterprise. So we can see an economic culture of informality by the language used to describe the ages of several different enslaved people. So for example, here we have first a man named Jose Cartagena de 24 años, or Jose Cartagena, who is 24 years old. Next, we have Francisco de 35 años, poco más o menos, or Francisco, who is more or less 35 years old. And finally, we have Juan, como de 14 años, Juan, who is about 14 years old. So here we have three different precisions when it comes to age, that is more or less or about. And this is all prior to the law. After the Free Womb Law was adopted in 1821, inventories became markedly more precise in reporting ages, particularly with regard to free womb children. This change is evident in the 1832 inventory of the Raspaluda gold mine, whose rivers were worked by 160 enslaved people and 120 free womb captives. While the language utilized to describe the enslaved people's ages remained informal, records specified the age of free womb children down to the year, month, and day año nacida. For example, the free womb girl, Maria Vicenta, was listed as being 4 years, 1 month, and 8 days old. In this sense, the free womb law intersected with emerging modern business practices that emphasize planning on the micro and macro levels, as well as greater precision of so-called asset management, features of capitalist culture that would expand in Colombia in the 1840s. We get a sense of this expansion of slavery's capitalism in Colombia during this period by examining the rise of, for example, savings banks. We'll be talking about this document momentarily. Savings banks that developed in the mid to late 1840s, which enslaved people participated in. And so this is, for me, a very fascinating document. It's a summary of deposits in the Caja de Ahorros, which is Spanish for savings bank. The first one was established, the first savings bank was established in the capital of Bogotá in 1846. This record is one from the Pacific coast of Colombia, and it's from March 1848. And on the right, you'll see how these depositors are classified. It includes los esclavos, 2 slaves, 2 enslaved people, who deposited a total of 77 pesos. And these records are fascinating because, in part, summaries like this were published in the national newspaper. So this is from La Gaceta Oficial. So they were circulating among the reading public. We can also see the expansion of capitalist practices through the passing of new ordinances, such as this one from the late 1840s, that obliged free womb captives who worked in domestic service to sign official contracts with their masters. And these sources are among the seeds of a different project I'm working on, examining slavery's capitalism in the so-called anti-slavery republics of South America. Nevertheless, returning to this document, we can see how the free womb law forced slaveholders to focus more precisely on the day-to-day details of their enterprises. This more intense calculation of the years, months, and days ticking by also forced slaveholders to imagine an eventual post-slavery order. I argue that this awareness of time and impending emancipation also affected the terminology used to refer to free womb children. And I do this through a careful analysis of the changing lexicon of free womb children in the notarial records of occasions. So this includes records like notes of sale, last will and testaments, and debt payments. I found that from the 1820s to the late 1830s, the free womb child status is described in particular ways that mark their special legal conditions. So this includes under the law of manumission, free by the law of manumission, or of the free womb. And so you can see an example of this here. But beginning in the late 1830s and increasingly during the 1840s, the children were referred to as manumitibos or manumisos, which translates into manumitted slaves. This term dating from the colonial period. See an example of it here. That these far older terms of manumitivo or manumiso replace references to the free womb law as a shorthand for the status of these children signals an attempt to gradually align these children's special legal status, thereby entrenching slavery's hold under gradual emancipation rule. Alternatively, the term might have signaled the ways in which the free womb children were increasingly considered manumitted subjects of the emerging Colombian state. Thus, not only was the free womb law a way of reinscribing on freedom through the rhetoric of freedom, but it was also seized upon by slaveholders as an opportunity for cheap labor and inadvertently bureaucratic modernization. But the Colombian free womb law was, borrowing from Barbara Fields, not a quote, fixed condition, but a constantly moving target. In the early 1840s, gradual emancipation rule was reconfigured when Colombian slaveholders changed the age of bondage. After July 1839, an entire generation of children born from enslaved mothers after 1821 were scheduled to turn 18, therefore allowing them to pursue a life of full freedom beyond their master's reach. And this phrase, full freedom, was one that was used by the kin of free womb children in freedom suits and self-purchases. However, Colombia's first civil war, the War of the Supremes, beginning in 1839, would modify that timeline. Very briefly, the slaveholding classes of Colombia feared this war because many captives and free Black people joined the rebel forces. And we could see this ominous racialization of the soldiers in this artistic rendition of the rebels at the time. Amid the Civil War, political pressure to modify the free womb law began to build. Finally passed in May 1842, in the aftermath of the war, a mandatory apprenticeship program was adopted, whereby the children of the free womb would be forced to work under a suitable master until the age of 25. So from 18 to 25 years of bondage, meaning 7 more years of forced labor. And if we know that the average life expectancy of a Colombian at the time was about 25 years of age, we can see how this apprenticeship program was essentially a life sentence. Colombian authorities no doubt found legal inspiration for the system of free womb apprenticeship in the various modifications to free womb laws adopted by their fellow republics in the Andes in the late 1830s and early 1840s. For example, in 1840, authorities in Venezuela changed their free womb law to force children to serve as apprentices until the age of 25. In 1839, Peru changed its free womb law to an even more repressive degree, extending the age of bondage to 50. In 1843, perhaps inspired by Colombia and other Andean republics, Ecuador's Congress increased the age of bondage as well for free womb children from 18 to 25. Moreover, in adopting this new system, Colombian officials were inspired especially by the British and their apprenticeship model in the West Indies. In the early 1840s, Colombian diplomatic officials in London and Kingston began to formally request the British government's acts, decrees, and regulations pertaining to emancipation. So here we can see how the British model helped shape the Colombian Congress's adoption of apprenticeship. And this larger history shows the many directional phases of 19th century Atlantic anti-slavery. 10 years after this new law, amid a liberal revolution in Colombia, Congress finally abolished slavery in January 1852. And the Colombian government passed final abolition with compensation to former slaveholders. And here you can see a compensation record for a former slaveholder from Buenaventura on the Pacific Coast for 6 enslaved people he possessed. And while I'm here, I want to briefly gesture to another digital project I'm in the very, very early stages of, and I hope to further pursue, which will digitize compensation records that are stored at the National Archives in Bogota, Colombia. So here you can see an example of one of those records that I used for my book. I'm happy to talk about these records. Yet, despite the final abolition of slavery, gradual emancipation rule remained insofar as many children of the free womb continued under the tutelage of their mothers' masters. Various officials, like the governor of Popayán in southwestern Colombia, argued that the final abolition law did not include the children of the free womb. The free womb captives thus remained in juridical limbo until April 1852, when Congress passed a law legally emancipating them. And among the thousands of emancipated free womb captives across Colombia was Magdalena. What ran through her mind, knowing her tormentor no longer had legal dominion over her, eludes us. Perhaps joining her mother, sister, or cousin, Magdalena would build a new world for herself that violated the wildest dreams of her captors. Yet, the violence of gradual emancipation rule had been done. Magdalena would never have her whole unbroken body back, and undoubtedly so much more. Thank you.
very much. So we have time for questions. Okay. And I think just the,
I don't know if you want it, kind of dark in here.
yes,
Yeah, sorry.
you want to have any questions?
Boss questions. If not, that's okay too. Sorry. That was fascinating. There's so many things that talk about. I guess, and I really like the way you talk about this period as gradual emancipation. Looking at it as something other than just a great thing. At it. That was really fascinating. I guess what I wanted to hear more about, I'm sure you think about kind of the way the early post-emancipation started and you refer to Barbara Fields. Her generation spent so much time thinking about freedom as a target in terms of the way that formerly enslaved people. I wonder if we could say more about the children themselves or the children's mothers. And I know that's, I expect that question. I just wonder if you could expand on that. Yeah, for sure. What their relationship was with this institution, right? Or masters, or even what it did to the family. Absolutely. Yeah, and I mean that's a huge question, one that I grappled with for a very, very long time. It's really interesting for at least this region of Pacific Lowlands, and I'm particularly focusing on the province of Trincoul in the northwestern, northwestern Colombia, is that there weren't many lawsuits, freedom suits, during this period, and so I collected or located about a total of, I think it was something like 12 freedom suits in this period, and that's just pales in comparison to what's happening in Brazil. A lot of that, I imagine, has to come from the fact that this is a very rural region, and so access to the courts is limited, as opposed to kind of urban environments that historians of slavery know very well. But for the ones that I was able to read, the question of families and the role of mothers is super central, and I get to that in chapter 4 of my book, when I have a specific section on how free and enslaved mothers in particular litigated the free will law in courts, and it's really fascinating. I mean, certainly the free will law transformed enslaved people's ability to have a right as a mother. And so, for example, I'm thinking of a specific case from the 1840s that I talk about in my book, where an enslaved woman was separated from her freeborn child. She was sold to another local slave trader. And so she says in this court case that the mother cannot be separated from her child until she is the age of puberty. And that's specifically referencing a specific clause in the free will law that said that freeborn children cannot be separated from their mothers until the age of puberty. And so it was really interesting because she proclaimed her status as a mother, right, and her right as a mother to be near and to possess her daughter. And in that case, she actually wins. There's a lot of reasons why she wins. I speculate, and I wrote this piece in the Americas talking about the free will trade and the limits of the free will trade, and how enslaved women in this case sometimes were able to succeed to maintain possession of the children. So, but by and far, it's a pretty unique picture, I would say. And of course, as historians, we have to be honest about what we find, right, in the archive and what it says. It seems like the majority of enslaved families who had free womb children maintain them, with their families, maintain them in that status of captivity, because otherwise, who would they go to? This is a region with also kind of free Black communities, so there were kind of relations, family relations, where I'm just thinking of kind of the safety, the kind of safety nets that might have been in place, but it was definitely something I was struggling and looking for kind of the findings that, folks like, of course, like Rebecca Scott and Kanika Cowling, and Natasha, Lightfoot, looking for the ways in which enslaved mothers, and particularly free Black mothers, utilize the law to their own ends, but it's just a very different context. Yeah. Yeah, but it's something, sorry, I could go on and on about this. Yeah, I get this question a lot, as you can imagine, and I think it's one of the central questions to ask. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting. I'm wondering, are the connections of how the racial racial, how it intersect with nationhood and citizenship of Black people. I noticed that not only racial movement, but also by politics, which automatically we need to think about population control. And since this the greater emancipation process was right at the beginning of the formation of Colombia as a nation, I'm wondering how there is this project of greater emancipation intersect with the nationhood of citizenship.
Yeah, that's a really big and important question. On the question of liberal racial governance and biopolitics, I talk about this in my book, but this, as you said, this law was passed in 1821. This is amid the immediate aftermath of creating the Republic of Gran Colombia. So this is one of the first policies on Black families, public policies on Black family formation in Colombian history. And so I point that out in my book, chapter 3, if you're curious, check that out. The question of liberal racial governance is very interesting. As I mentioned in my presentation, this was a period in which, after the Wars of Independence, or amid, but eventually after the Wars of Independence, we have a policy where racial hierarchies are officially kind of disappeared, right? They're erased in official policies and official records. And so it's really fascinating, because the only marker of difference in this period is whether someone is a free person or an enslaved person. But the free womb children occupy this very weird status condition amid this kind of, free, unfree kind of world. And they're constantly being referred to by their racialized condition. So young Black girl, young Black boy, other words as well. So there's something different that's happening here in terms of how free womb children are being treated amid this kind of, amid this kind of new race neutral, liberal racial kind of policies that are happening in this period. There was more I wanted to say, but the question of citizenship. It's interesting because, again, I was thinking about your comment, Dr. Cabrera. I came into this project really kind of inspired by this work on emancipation, on post-emancipation studies, and also on popular politics, particularly in Colombia. Jane Sanders, for example, and Alfonso Munera and Marix Alazo are so important for my kind of intellectual and historical development. All to say that I was searching for kind of struggles for citizenship and political inclusion that we see in many of those, in all of those authors. But it's a different context. The struggles are about territoriality, about family formation, about autonomy, It's a different kind of space and context. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, I'm curious about the goal. Clean mindset, what is it, how does it structure society and how does this social structure of like this whole goal kind of like change with the graduation?
No, absolutely. I mean, gold is everywhere in the book. It structures everything, everyday life, terror life, political life. In this period, so this is what I'm looking at is basically the 1820s to 1850s. It's kind of like in the heyday of kind of the big quadrillas, which are the slave gangs, is over. So this is mostly kind of smaller slave gangs that are mining the river for gold. So this is like it's placer mining. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the kind of different gold mining techniques. So this is like panning the river for gold.
Right, so it's area, like it's not drilling.
It's no drilling. Yeah, this is panning the river for gold. And as I talked about in chapter 1 of my book, most of the gold miners, whether free or enslaved, are women. And they're deemed to be the expert gold miners of this period. Whether that's, panning the river for gold, or also being divers. So there's this very horrible story about an enslaved woman who was a diver and she was diving the river for gold, that I talk about that in my book. And gold is so important to obviously the economy of the region, but for the understanding how Black freedom, the story of Black freedom in this region. And so, as I again talk about in my book, Black women gold miners are the central agents for legally emancipating enslaved and free children in this period. There's so much more I can say about gold. I wrote another book a while ago about gold, and I incorporated some of the archival findings from Choco in 1810, this period in 1810, and trying to connect doing a sort of elusive historical thread of time between gold and Colombia and Spain and Greece. But again, that's a kind of other story.
Questions? You have a question? Check. If you have a question, check. See if I can read it properly. Thanks so much for the talk, for your work. City. Kind of alluded to this. I want to ask about the impact of flight in the city. Flight. A sparsely populated rural area, settlement, numerous many state Black people. How significant numeric was the state? And what was the relative social standing of different categories and gradations of freedom, monumented state freedom?
Thank you so much for that question. I realize actually you asked another question about gold in relation to, gosh, I just had it. Maybe
I guess maybe how social structure.
how it transformed. Yeah, very quickly. I mean, basically the gold mines were radically transformed in terms of the labor. So you can see kind of a gold mine that would be operated entirely by enslaved people and 1803 by 1840, about 80% of the laboring population on a gold mine was free women captives. And so you see letter after letter and private, records of slaveholders complaining about the eventual destruction of the gold mines because these free women captives would eventually be emancipated and no one would be able to go to gold mines. And so in terms of kind of the day-to-day practices, it's hard to really know just because of the records, the limitations of records. So I hope that answers some of your question. But regarding flight, I mean, it's a really important question. So I gestured to that in my talk, talking about how plentiful rainforests cover and rivers, literally hundreds of rivers and streams, to commit disappearing acts. What's really fascinating about this region as well is that you don't see the development of runaway slave communities that you see, for example, in Palenque, San Isidro de Palenque, or in Santa Marta, or the Maroons, obviously making it Jamaica, Quilombos in Brazil, because it's a really, it's again, it goes back to what a remarkable place this is. What we had instead are essentially free Black villages that are legally allowable. They're legally allowed to be run. This is a place where white people don't really want to be. They sort of, I see you nodding your head. White people don't want to be here. And they essentially leave it to indigenous and Afro-Colombian people and mixed race people to run and operate. And so it's just, the question of flight is different here. That being said, the few white people that do inhabit the region are very, very upset and concerned with the unpredictability of that the forests and the rivers represent, because the rivers, as I talk about in chapter 1 of my book, are controlled by free Black men and women. I have this basically a travel log that I use where this Frenchman who is trying to go to this gold mine in the 1820s, and he's left stranded in the middle of the jungle and can't do anything, and so he's freaking out, and eventually buys off an Afro-Colombian man, a boatman, to take him down to the gold mine, and it pays an exorbitant, as he says, price for it. But this is just, it's an extraordinary place. Yes.
Saying I'm sorry, I'm right, so I don't know if you've already spoken to this, but I was just going to raise another class. I think really question, and that is, to what extent in Choco or more broadly in Colombia would you say that the enslaved, the agency of the enslaved contributed to the emancipation process?
Yeah. Yeah, a very important question. And you're talking about agency in terms of influencing or shaping the gradual emancipation law, right? Yeah, I don't tackle that in my book. I simply did not have the sources to do that. I had different sources that told me about how enslaved and free Black people and free women captives were impacted by the law. So it's a different project. That being said, I know that our student Marcela Echeverri is working on that question, and so we're all eagerly anticipating that project. But it's a crucial one, but it's not one that I really was able to kind of certainly. I mean, as referring back to Professor Perez's question, I tackle the question of agency in terms of how enslaved and free Black mothers were able to adapt to the law and use the law for their advantage. But it's something that the sources I just weren't there.
Hey, thank you so much, Mr. Opportunity, really rich. I'm curious about the conversations that officials were having as they were drawing on the British model of apprenticeship. So by the time we get to the early 40s and then into the 50s, they should have been really aware of what worked and what did not, like the failures of apprenticeship. So I'm wondering what those conversations in terms of the particularities of that particular nation as they compare to what happened in the British territories.
Yeah, no, that's a really a great question, and I'm just thinking, I'm pausing because I had a version of this question a couple of years ago. In part, I'm pausing too because the British story is, I don't have an answer for you really, because I didn't do work in Jamaica or British Archives to further pursue that, but the Select Committee is doing that, so stay tuned. What I will say, oh, the question of failure is super interesting because, God, there's. So this question of failure was not really, or the understanding that emancipation was a apprenticeship model and post emancipation period was a failed model wasn't really a thing actually in the 1840s and 50s. It wasn't well into the late 19th century, from what I understand, where that really became a kind of major point of discussion among maybe I'm wrong. Do you know, Dr. Ferrer? No. I want to say that's the answer because it's something that I definitely looked into and pursued. And so, all to say, by the 1840s and 50s, from what I understand, the question of failure really wasn't one that was at the forefront of people's understandings of this kind of post-emancipation kind of project. Yeah, but I feel like I didn't fully answer your question. So, did you have any? Did you want to add anything else?
No, it's okay, because I, just to be clear, I was not speaking about what the British were thinking when officials in Colombia, right? When people do that, they're like, oh, this is not your area, but what were they thinking? No, I meant in terms of their conversations in your region as they're drawing on that to enact new
Yeah, I don't know the specifics of that, but I know from the records that they were petitioning for laws and acts and decrees. And this was based on the British Bill, yeah. And this was like a month, which is also I'm trying to figure out. I was trying to figure out a month before the three-woman apprenticeship system was established in Colombia. So it's trying to figure out like what circumstances that was all happening. It's interesting, but yeah, sorry, I don't think I answered.
Yeah, I was really fascinated by the question of compensation. Showed that sheet up there and said you were starting a new project, and I just want, given the question of compensation and reparations is always so critical and urgent, I wondered if you could just say something more about that, about those records.
Yeah, I mean they're chilling, they're harrowing, they're when I was it's interesting too because the records are located in the Fondo Manumission, so the manumission folder, which I find interesting thinking about final abolition still as kind of this act of manumission. It's kind of private act. Yeah, they're fascinating for the kind of I call them in my book kind of like the paper bodies, and they're these compensation records. So the ones that I showed you here are the kind of records that are held by the government, central government in Bogota. So they're getting all these different requests coming from different regions and provinces for these compensation records. And so they usually list the name and the age and the price for the enslaved person that the slaveholder was to be compensated for. And they really give a very chilling snapshot of kind of this last moment of time in which these people are captive, right? At the same time, I also wonder to what extent, I don't know, sorry, I'm going off in different directions, but I don't know if enslaved people had access to or were able to obtain these compensation records as well. And if that was the case, if those were kind of their own freedom papers in case abolition would be, abolished, if you understand what I mean. But as I also document in my book, the compensation records are, after the abolition of slavery in 1852, are sort of traded amongst slaveholders well into the 1850s and the early 1860s. They're still using them. You can see them in the last will and testaments. You can see them to pay off debts. And so, the bodies of enslaved peoples are still circulating in that paper form. Well into the post-emancipation period. There's a lot to say there, but I'll just say, yeah, the question of reparations, certainly. And so I'm hoping with this digitization project to link it up to question the reparations movement in Afro-Colombian political organizing, which is so salient right now, making a vice president, Garcia Marquez, who's the most amazing person in the world. Yeah, there's a lot to say, but
Well, these will be the last two questions. So one question I have for you is, my understanding is that, the term, the name Mina is common in the area.
Mhm.
And that, in the, for example, in the Brazilian context, this term Mina probably refers to prolific. But there's speculation, going back to Professor John's question, that this term Mina somehow relates to the fact that these people are working gold mine. So I was just wondering if you have any thoughts about that. And then the final question is, so what happens once these children are adults? They're 18 or 25, and they are for free.
Mhm.
Yeah, are they? Nice. So do they remain with enslaved parents?
Yeah.
Do they try to stay with them through churches? Way, can you give us a sense of what their lives are?
it's impossible to know. The records just aren't, they don't speak in that way, which is, yeah, tragic for the historian, obviously, complicated for the person who's actually the free room, the formerly free room adult. Yeah, so regarding the first question, Mina, so for the region that I study, principally of Choco and the lower southern Pacific coast, well, principally for Choco, I'll say, the surname Mina was not very common. So typically you have enslaved people adopting, like many places of the African diaspora, adopting the name of their enslavers. So, for example, like Mosquera, very common in the period. Arboleda, these are the names. These are the names of. These are the names. These are the names of the white league. Yeah. And so, but the question of Mina and its relation to gold mining is interesting, and that's certainly something, when I was trying, I think this goes back to Professor Tiam, is that?
Yeah.
Professor Tiam's question about gold, what's particularly about this region is that majority of gold miners are women, and enslaved and free Black women. And when I was doing research trying to figure out what's happening here, why is that the case? Certainly that's not happening in 18th century Minas Gerais, for example, where the enslaved men were the majority gold miners of that period. And I speculated, might it have to do with kind of traditions coming from Western Africa, thinking specifically of Ghana, and traditions of women gold miners, in fact, young people, children gold miners. I'm not sure, it's hard to say. The question about free womb, what happens when they reach the age of adulthood, like I said, I don't have an answer for you. The records don't allow me to tell that story. Obviously, I can speculate. But what I will say is that it reminds me of one record that I used. And so the gradual emancipation law, I won't get into the weeds too much, but basically, there's a mechanism in the gradual emancipation law that allows the kin of free womb children to purchase their freedom. Now, for the period that I examined the notarial records from 1820s to 1851, I found only a handful of cases where enslaved or free Black families purchased the freedom, the full freedom of free womb children. But there were 3 cases which were really interesting where the full freedom was purchased of these free womb children. And then that it goes to court. Basically, the inheritor of this gold mine claims that they were not justly assessed. And so essentially a bounty is put on their heads and they're being pursued. There are kind of stories that the free womb children who are now fully free, but sort of they're being seeked to be placed back into captivity. But there's kind of stories that they might be in Cali and who could find them and they might be dead and who knows, but it's a kind of a chilling kind of reminder that that their freedom is tenuous, essentially, even if they're fully free.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Coming out. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.